Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that's as old as time, but as oddly entertaining as a late night snack you didn't ask for. Imagine yourself sitting on the edge of a creaky wooden chair, the faint buzz of a restless fan mixing with the distant hoot of an owl outside your window. You probably won't survive this without a few surprises, because history isn't just dusty dates, it's forgotten scandals and moments so bizarre they make reality TV look tame. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's kind of fun knowing who's traveling through time with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the drawbridge of medieval assumptions, dragging with you a big ol' sack of knight in shining armor cliches. Because let's face it, thanks to fairy tales, you probably think being courted by a knight meant roses, poems, and slightly awkward horseback rides. But the truth, far muddier. Quite literally, those knights, clunky, sweaty, and, more often than not, about as emotionally available as a trebuchet. They were the celebrities of their day, sure. Glamorous on the surface, covered in steel, wrapped in codes of chivalry that were supposed to make them gallant and honorable. But here's the catch. Chivalry was more PR campaign than practice. Think of it as the medieval version of a heavily filtered Instagram feed. What you saw wasn't always what you got. Knights were bound by codes of conduct, yes, but those codes applied mostly to how they treated other knights. Not peasants, not serfs, and certainly not women. There were rules against attacking fellow noblemen, and maybe some flowery language about protecting the innocent. But when push came to shove, and oh, there was a lot of shoving, it was often just brute force and high-stakes drama. You imagine a woman, say, Lady Eleanor of someplace sounding like an estate, sitting by the castle window. She's watching her knight ride off again, waving his lance like it's a personality trait. He's off to defend honor or attack someone's sheep, depending on how bored he is. And she's left behind, maybe with a spinning wheel, maybe with a lute, definitely with an overwhelming sense of meh. Meanwhile, the monk down the road, Brother Aldrich, let's call him, is trimming lavender in the abbey's herb garden, humming a Gregorian chant under his breath. He's not in anyone's face, he doesn't stink of horse. And most importantly, he listens. Lady Eleanor wanders over one afternoon, ostensibly to pray. But really, she's just looking for a moment of peace, not punctuated by swords and shouting. And Brother Aldrich, bless him, knows the value of silence. One mainstream historical fact here. Chivalry was a real thing, originally developed as a way to discipline the brutal, often violent behavior of knights during the 12th century. It tried to create a moral and social code to guide how warriors should act. But historians still argue whether this chivalric code genuinely changed behavior, or just made for better propaganda on stained glass windows. Let's be honest, women didn't exactly get a choice in their love lives. Marriages were arranged, strategic, and often just glorified trade deals. Here, take my daughter and let me borrow your army for a year. But that doesn't mean women didn't have preferences, or quiet dreams, or moments of sneaking away from all that armored pageantry. Now, let's talk a little about the knights' actual appeal. Sure, they had charisma. If you like men who talk about jousting like it's their personal TED Talk. But many women were smart enough to know that knights brought more than roses. They brought war, long absences, jealousy, and frankly, some very uncomfortable fashion choices. Imagine trying to hug someone wearing full chainmail. It's less romantic and more like being gently sandpapered by a metallic porcupine. And on top of all that, knights were not exactly known for emotional literacy. The training began young, 7 years old in many cases, and focused on swordsmanship, horsemanship, and enduring pain without flinching. Not exactly the curriculum for building empathetic partners. So by the time a knight reached maturity, he was more or less a walking tank, with the emotional vocabulary of a potato. Meanwhile, monks were also products of their training, but their days were filled with contemplation, not combat. They prayed, they studied, they illuminated manuscripts with tiny gold leaf letters and painted angels that looked slightly suspicious of everything. They understood silence. And that's something a lot of women in those castles might have craved more than a love poem shouted over a battlefield. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some monks use coded marginalia in their manuscripts, small, hidden doodles in the corners, that scholars now believe may have been playful messages or even quiet inside jokes passed among the brothers. Imagine flipping through a holy text and finding a tiny ink drawing of a rabbit jousting a snail. Yup, real thing. Not exactly sinful, but definitely cheeky. Now, there's something ironic about all this. Because in stories, knights always get the girl. But in life, some girls were quietly slipping away to spend time in abbey gardens, taking long walks that ended near cloisters, not castles. There's even historical documentation, though rare and always whispered, of noble women who funded monasteries and convents, not just for piety, but because they wanted to spend more time in those peaceful spaces, with those peaceful men. Again, we're not talking steamy romance novels here. We're talking sleepy admiration, trust, a kind of warmth that didn't clang around in armor or shout things like "for the realm" at breakfast. It was in the slow rituals, the quiet kindnesses, the way a monk might pass someone a sprig of rosemary during prayer, no words needed. Still, historians argue whether women genuinely preferred monks, or whether the preference was more about escaping the rigid roles imposed by medieval courtship. Was it about the men themselves, or about reclaiming a bit of peace and independence in a world that rarely allowed it? Like everything in history, the answer is somewhere in the fog between fact and interpretation. Either way, by the end of this section, you start to feel the difference. Knights were loud, fast, explosive. They wrote their stories in broken bones and muddy fields. Monks, they etched their legacy in candlelight and quiet routine. And sometimes, silence is more seductive than sonnets. So next time you picture a fair maiden looking longingly out a tower window, maybe don't assume she's dreaming of a knight galloping to her rescue. Maybe, just maybe, she's hoping for someone who smells like lavender and reads Latin. You're still lingering in the soft shadows of that abbey garden, aren't you? Can't blame you. Compared to the brawling theatrics of knightly life, there's something deeply soothing about the stillness of a monastery. The way the light filters through stained glass. The slow, steady rhythm of footsteps on worn stone. It's not that monks were perfect, far from it, but their vibe, immaculate. So let's wander in deeper, past the gates of medieval clamor and into the gentle hum of monastic life. If knights were the booming drums of their era, monks were the distant flute. And some women, especially noble women, who'd had their fill of castle drama, preferred the flute. Here's the thing. Medieval monasteries weren't just religious centers. They were the original wellness retreats. Tucked away from battlefields and banquet halls, these cloistered communities offered something revolutionary for the time: emotional space. You're not dodging drunken squires or navigating passive-aggressive in-laws. You're walking between rosemary bushes, listening to Gregorian chants echo off cold stone. And monks? They weren't out there charging into enemies or spouting war poems. They were more likely to be transcribing scripture, tending to beehives, or composing music in 8-part harmony. It's hard to imagine, say, Sir Baldwin of Unnecessary Violence picking up a lute and humming a melody about divine mercy. But Brother Cedric, that's his Tuesday. Now, it wasn't just about the monk's schedule. It was how they moved through the world. Monks lived by the rule of Saint Benedict, at least in Western Europe, which emphasized humility, obedience, and silence. That's right. Actual rules encouraging men not to talk over you. A miracle in any century. Let's say you're Lady Alina, Your husband's been off fighting in Flanders for 3 months. Your kids are squabbling over who gets to inherit the best goat. And your steward just tried to tax you for your own vegetables. You want to scream, but instead, you walk to the nearby abbey. The monks greet you without judgment. They don't interrupt. They don't try to fix you. They just are. That's the monk appeal. Mainstream historical fact time. Many monasteries acted as social hubs, not just for the devout, but also for travelers, nobles, and local villagers. Women often sought advice or sanctuary in these quiet, sacred spaces, sometimes even escaping the confines of marriage or noble expectations by donating land in exchange for refuge. And speaking of refuge, one quirky little gem: some monks kept cats not just for pest control, but because they liked them. In fact, there's a 9th century Irish poem where a monk wrote about his beloved cat, Pangur Bán, comparing his feline's mouse hunting to his own text hunting during scripture study. It's sweet, it's cozy, it's the medieval version of watching a guy knit and not making a big deal about it. Now picture that. You've been bombarded with tales of tournaments and crusades. Your world is ruled by swords and suspicion. But down the road is a man who, gasp, doesn't want anything from you, who talks in soft tones and says things like, "Would you like some honey? The bees were very generous this spring." Instant swoon. And if you think this was all just innocent admiration, well, historians still argue whether some monks and noblewomen formed quiet emotional bonds that slipped a toe across the line of official decorum. Was it affection? Spiritual kinship? A flirtation wrapped in robes and scripture? We'll never know for sure, but some letters, some donations, and some suspiciously long visits do suggest a kind of intimacy that wasn't strictly divine. Now let's step back and talk about emotional availability. Knights were trained to compartmentalize, to conquer, to dominate. Monks, they were trained to reflect, to surrender, to listen. Imagine how revolutionary that must have felt to women who were used to being talked at. Suddenly they were being heard. It wasn't all incense and enlightenment, though. Monasteries had their flaws. Internal politics, corruption, occasionally smug celibacy flexes. But in terms of vibe, they nailed it. Their appeal wasn't just, "He won't stab anyone today." It was deeper. It was, "He knows my favorite psalm and doesn't bring up taxes while I'm crying." And that gentleness extended beyond personality. The monastery itself was built for peace. Arched ceilings, cloister walks, the quiet shuffle of sandals on flagstone, even the food, simple stews, fresh herbs, homemade cheese, felt like a protest against the overcooked venison and performative gluttony of the noble courts. So why did some women prefer monks? Because sometimes all you want is someone who gets it. Not in a performative, "let me rescue you on horseback" kind of way, but in a, "here's a seat, let's breathe together" kind of way. And monks were, oddly enough, ahead of their time on that front. Let's not over-romanticize it, though. Most monks weren't writing poetry for passing duchesses. They had strict routines, harsh winters, and a lifetime ban on sex that, let's face it, didn't always stick. There are records of monks who, despite their vows, got a little too emotionally, and sometimes physically, involved with female patrons or visitors. There were consequences, yes, but the fact that these lapses happened at all hints at something important. These weren't robots in robes. They were human, and humans, no matter how devout, get lonely. The women they interacted with weren't just damsels sneaking love notes through chapel windows. Some were intellectual equals, patrons of the arts, or women navigating an impossible world and grasping at one of the few spaces that felt safe. So if Lady Alina sat a little longer than usual in the herb garden, chatting with Brother Cedric about theology, no one said much, but everyone noticed, because deep down, people understood the pull, the soft magnetism of a man who didn't shout, who read books, who walked barefoot at dawn to watch the mist rise over the river and said things like, "God is in the quiet." Honestly, that's romantic. And while court poets were out there waxing lyrical about knights slaying dragons for love, there were women in real castles who preferred their dragons metaphorical and slayed with inner peace. So you ask yourself, would you rather spend your days with someone who brings home battle wounds and a superiority complex, or someone who brings you chamomile and a Latin pun? Exactly. You know what doesn't get enough credit in medieval matchmaking? The nose. That's right. Your noble-born nostrils would have been the first to alert you to whether your romantic life was going to smell like tragedy or tranquility. Because for all their flashy armor and poetic war cries, knights didn't exactly pass the sniff test. Let's not dance around it. Knights stank. No, seriously. Armor was hot, heavy, and nearly impossible to clean. These guys spent hours, even days, trapped inside layers of metal and wool, sweating through combat drills or actual battles. Hygiene wasn't a strong point, and even if you were lucky enough to get one of the rare nightly baths, it probably happened in a tub the size of a barrel, with water that had already seen a few reuses. Romantic? Hardly. Now contrast that with a monastery. Monks lived in a world where cleanliness was, surprisingly, part of the routine. Sure, they weren't scrubbing with citrus-scented body wash, but they washed hands before meals, faces in the morning, and feet on holy days. They worked with herbs, lavender, rosemary, chamomile, sometimes growing them in lush little plots inside cloistered walls. The result? A daily environment that smelled more like beeswax and freshly baked bread than old leather and fermented horse. So when you're imagining Lady Isabel deciding who she might rather spend a quiet hour with, it's no surprise if her heart and sinuses lean monkward. Let's dig into some specifics. Knights wore padded garments under their armor, called gambesons. These thick, quilted tunics were great for absorbing impact, but also excellent at absorbing everything else. Imagine wrapping yourself in a woolen mattress pad, running a marathon, then sleeping in it for a week. That's the knightly aesthetic. And then there was the ever-present aroma of the stables. Horses were essential to the knightly image. War horses especially, the medieval equivalent of a sports car. But they were also walking, neighing scent dispensers. Knights were often coated in the smells of hay, manure, sweat, and blood, all mingling in a particularly pungent cloud that made it hard to forget just how recently they'd decapitated someone. Meanwhile, monks didn't just smell better. They lived in places that felt better. Monastic spaces were designed with sensory calm in mind. The cloisters were quiet, the chapels resonated with soft chants, and even the kitchens were slow-paced and earthy. There's something soothing about a place that smells like warm bread and honeycomb, isn't there? Now here's your quirky fringe fact. Some monks created their own medieval perfumes. Yep, essentially DIY cologne. They'd use crushed herbs, floral oils, and even distilled spirits to create scented balms and tinctures. These weren't just for religious ceremonies either. They were sometimes applied before prayer or as subtle offerings of comfort to visitors. Imagine Brother Anselm passing Lady Isabel a cloth scented with rosemary and rosewater. Just a little gesture, no scandal, but definitely memorable. So while knights were out there dripping in chainmail and horse sweat, monks were experimenting with lavender oil and bathing rituals tied to religious purity. Even their candles smelled nice. Beeswax over tallow every time. And if you think this is all a bit too superficial, just about odor, consider this. Scent was deeply tied to spirituality in the Middle Ages. Cleanliness wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was associated with purity. Saintly figures were often said to exude sweet fragrances after death. Odor of sanctity, they called it. So a good-smelling man wasn't just easier on the nose, he was seen as closer to God. Historians still argue whether these associations with scent genuinely influenced medieval attraction, or if it's more of a modern interpretation. But let's be honest, when your other options are sweat-drenched battle bros with a penchant for throat-singing war chants, a lavender-scented bookworm starts to look mighty fine. Let's not forget the interiors either. The knight's castle? cold, drafty, full of shouting and the clatter of goblets. The monks' monastery? Stone floors, yes, but arranged around peaceful courtyards, where the most dramatic noise might be a fountain trickling or a robin clearing its throat in the rafters. One was chaos, the other calm. Now imagine being a woman surrounded by a constant cycle of feast, famine, and forced diplomacy. Someone brings you a goblet of watered wine and asks, again, if you've written your cousin about the dowry dispute. You excuse yourself. You walk to the edge of the estate, just far enough to breathe. At the edge of the woods, there's a gate to the monastery garden. A monk looks up, nods, and returns to pruning the mint. That moment, that breath, that smell, that's what starts to shift everything. Of course, not all monks smelled great. They were still humans with fluctuating bathing schedules and occasionally suspect footwear, but on the whole, their life encouraged tidiness. Not for appearance's sake, but as an act of spiritual order. When you cleaned your hands before breaking bread, it wasn't just for hygiene, it was for humility. And when everything in your world is dictated by hierarchy and status, humility smells really good. Knights, by contrast, didn't exactly go for minimalism. Their armor was decorated, their horses barded in family colors, their swords engraved with dramatic mottos like "Death before dishonor," or "This blade is my soul." You know, the usual. The performance of masculinity was exhausting, and not just for the knights. For the women who had to entertain them, bandage them, mourn them, it got old. So it makes perfect sense that some women found something irresistible in the monk who didn't try to impress them at all, who wasn't flexing, who wasn't demanding, who was just there, present, soft-spoken, and probably carrying a satchel that smelled like dried figs and frankincense. It's ironic, isn't it? That in a world obsessed with power and performance, the real allure came from someone who rejected all that. A man who spent his days contemplating eternity and trimming basil might not win a joust, but he could win a heart through something as simple as offering a clean bench in the shade. And so the choice begins to make more and more sense. Not because monks were saints, not because knights were villains, but because scent and setting matter. Because peace, kindness, and good-smelling candlelight can be more attractive than armor and ego. So next time you imagine medieval courtship, don't just picture the knight with his sword raised high. Picture the monk, kneeling in a garden, pressing a sprig of thyme into your palm with a quiet smile. That's the real plot twist. You've smelled the difference, now let's talk about vibes. Because sometimes peace is sexier than passion, especially when your daily life is one long, anxious sigh. And while knights stormed castles and made dramatic exits, monks just stayed. That's right, they stuck around, quietly existing without starting any wars. And sometimes that was the most attractive quality of all. Life in the medieval world wasn't exactly chill. There were famines, plagues, surprise tax increases, and your cousin Geoffrey probably kept trying to claim part of your dowry using a forged scroll and a goat witness. So when your knightly husband left for the Crusades, or just for a bar brawl that turned into a 3-week campaign, you were left to manage everything, alone. That's when you'd start noticing how nice it was that Brother Matthew, down at the monastery, didn't bring that kind of chaos. No galloping, no shouting, no risk of sudden duels over who insulted whose hawk. Just rhythm, predictability, a daily schedule that didn't involve siege towers. Let's be real. Drama has its charm for about 10 minutes. Then it becomes exhausting, and nights were nothing if not walking, sword-swinging stress generators. They were trained to compete, conquer, and assert dominance. Everything was a contest. Who had the shiniest armor, the best-trained falcon, the largest serving of mutton? And guess what? That kind of energy never turns off. Even at home, a knight was still in performance mode. He might bring you a trophy from his latest tourney, sure, but also a deep need to be worshipped for it. He wanted admiration, obedience, and probably a foot massage. And don't even try having a nuanced conversation about your feelings. Unless your feelings involve fealty, he's tuning out. Monks, on the other hand, weren't trying to win anything. Their days followed a calm, predictable rhythm. Prayers at dawn, work in the gardens, maybe some quiet study or scribing, more prayers, a small meal, silent sleep. The most intense thing on their schedule was Vespers. That kind of routine, in a world full of chaos, incredibly appealing, and monasteries were built for that kind of peace. Even their architecture felt meditative. The cloisters weren't just practical, they were symbolic, designed for inward reflection, calm repetition, and quiet passage. You walked in circles, literally and spiritually, and sometimes that kind of gentle pacing was exactly what a weary soul needed. Historical fact here, monks followed ora et labora, pray and work, as their central life principle, especially in Benedictine orders. Their daily tasks weren't just chores, they were spiritual expressions. Tending to bees or mending robes was seen as holy labor. It made them steady, present, and grounded. And women, especially noble women, used to court politics and power plays, noticed. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Some monks kept pet hedgehogs in their gardens. Why? Pest control. They ate insects, but also possibly because hedgehogs are objectively adorable. Just picture a robed man named Brother Thomas, gently feeding a tiny hedgehog a worm at dusk. If that's not peak calm energy, nothing is. Compare that to the castle scene. A knight throws open the door, flings off his helmet, and yells for wine. Someone's already fighting in the hall, and the cooks just quit because someone tried to joust the soup cauldron. The next thing you know, you're being asked to mediate a dispute over which cousin insulted, which lineage over which boiled parsnip. Monks didn't need attention. They weren't performing masculinity, they were opting out of it, choosing devotion over domination, and sometimes that quiet withdrawal from worldly ego made them stand out more than any shining lance ever could. Historians still argue whether women truly saw monks as alternatives to romantic partners, or simply spiritual companions. But in the absence of emotional safety elsewhere, those quiet relationships, whatever their exact form, offered sanctuary. Some noble women even moved closer to monasteries after becoming widows. Not into convents necessarily, though some did, but into estates adjacent to the monastic grounds, where they could spend their later years in peaceful semi-retirement. It wasn't about becoming nuns, it was about proximity to peace. There's something poignant in that, isn't there? Choosing a life not of thrill, but of stillness. Not because you're running from love, but because you've seen what unchecked power does to it. You've seen how castles can become prisons, how romance can curdle into conquest. In the monastery, no one's checking your dowry. No one's expecting heirs. You're allowed to just be. And sometimes you're being beside someone who brews mint tea and sings psalms in 4-part harmony. Of course, let's not oversell it. Not every monk was a walking spa day. Some were irritable, sleep-deprived, or weirdly obsessed with copying the letter G perfectly in gold ink. But the point isn't that monks were better partners, it's that they were different. Different from the overcompensating masculinity of their knightly counterparts. Different in a way that offered something rare, emotional rest. One can only imagine the relief of entering a monastery's guest house and not having to flatter, defend, or explain. Just soft voices, shared bread, and maybe a hedgehog. Even letters from women to monasteries hint at this emotional pull. Some documents survive with notes of gratitude, of longing, of connection, not romantic necessarily, but deeply human. These weren't transactional interactions, they were relational, which, in an age where marriage was mostly a business deal, mattered more than you'd think. Imagine Lady Eleanor again. She doesn't need a hero, she needs a place to breathe. And if she can find it with someone who listens, who doesn't judge, who smells like sage and beeswax, well, that's more than a fairy tale. That's survival. So when the knight comes riding back, armor gleaming, demanding celebration, maybe she smiles politely. but her eyes drift toward the path that leads away from the shouting and into the soft stillness of the cloister garden, where Brother Matthew will offer her quiet company and not expect applause. Because in a world obsessed with noise, the real rebellion was rest. And now you've wandered past the cloisters, past the lavender bushes, past the tiny hedgehog with the world's most relaxed social calendar, and into the scriptorium. It's quiet here. So quiet you can hear the gentle scratch of a quill on parchment, the occasional rustle of a woolen robe, the slow, sacred rhythm of someone turning a page. This isn't just where monks copied holy texts. It's where knowledge lived. And in a world where literacy was rare and letters even rarer, monks didn't just read books, they were the books. So what does that have to do with women preferring monks over knights? Everything. You see, knights could barely spell their own names. That's not an insult. It's just how education worked. Unless they were unusually privileged and interested, most knights weren't trained in reading or writing. Their strength was physical, strategic, loud. But monks, they knew how to wield words. That meant they could write letters, real ones. And sometimes those letters weren't just about church politics or crop rotations. Sometimes they were tender. Because here's the secret. While knights performed their love in public, with jousts, with trophies, with increasingly aggressive poetry shouted from balconies, monks, if they dared to feel something, had to express it quietly, carefully, between the lines. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, monasteries were among the only institutions where reading and writing were practiced regularly. Monks copied and preserved not only religious texts, but also secular works of philosophy, medicine, and yes, romantic poetry. They were the keepers of language in a largely illiterate world. That means if a noblewoman had any access to writing at all, it probably came from or passed through a monastery. And while it's easy to imagine these exchanges as purely transactional, land deeds, prayers for gold exchanges, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were deeply personal. And now for your fringe tidbit. Among the preserved writings from medieval monasteries are small notes and poems tucked into the margins of books. Not just religious musings. Some were flirtatious, playful, even poetic. In one Irish manuscript, a scribe wrote a short verse about a woman's singing voice, gentle, private, reverent, but unmistakably admiring. So imagine this. You're Lady Marin, married at 16 to a man twice your age who treats you like part of the inventory. You love music, but there's no one in your stone-cold castle who understands your favorite hymn, let alone why the second verse moves you to tears. But then a monk visits the estate to discuss grain production. Over dinner, he quotes a line of Saint Hildegard's music, your favorite. His eyes light up, not romantically necessarily, but like he gets it. Like he hears the world the way you do. Later, you send a thank you note via a steward. He sends back a psalm, copied in his own hand, with a note beneath. This one reminded me of your voice. No scandal. Nothing that could get either of you accused of impropriety. But in a world where you've been reduced to titles and alliances, that one sentence feels like freedom. Historians still debate whether such letters were common or rare, romantic or spiritual. Some argue that monks, despite their vows, engaged in emotional affairs, bonded through words, glances, and scripture laced with double meanings. Others say we project modern ideas of intimacy onto gestures that were simply pious. But one thing is clear. Monks had the tools to express subtlety, to connect through more than just presence. They understood metaphor. They saw the beauty in quiet things, and sometimes that made all the difference. Meanwhile, your knight is back from campaign. He's bragging about how he disarmed a Saracen using only his belt buckle and raw courage. He's reenacting it for the 10th time during supper, knocking over the bread with a dramatic lunge. He doesn't notice you're not laughing, or that your mind has drifted to a note tucked into your psalter, one that smells faintly of dried lavender. And that's the thing. Monks didn't just have better vocabulary. They had intention. They weren't performing love for applause. If they felt it at all, they had to whisper it into metaphors, prayers, or poems, which made it feel secret, sacred, and yes, dangerously alluring. Plus, let's not overlook the sheer magic of a handwritten letter in a world where most communication was face-to-face and often filled with power dynamics. A letter was private, personal, portable, something you could fold, hide, reread by candlelight. Imagine that, being seen not in public rituals or pageantry, but in a line of ink chosen just for you. The monasteries weren't dating apps, of course, and most monks never crossed any lines. But emotional connection doesn't need to be physical to be real. And for women trapped in loveless transactional marriages, a thoughtful note could mean more than a dozen feasts. Back to the scriptorium. Rows of monks, bent over pages, copying not just words but ideas. Love poems from Ovid, philosophy from Boethius, lamentations that ache like longing. These men lived in a world of slow, deliberate meaning. And if you caught one of their rare, careful smiles, well, it probably meant something. Even the way they read was different. Silent reading was still becoming common in the Middle Ages, but monks were among its first practitioners. To read quietly, to yourself, was once considered mysterious, intimate, almost like listening to someone's thoughts. So the monk who read to you from a book wasn't just sharing words. He was sharing his world, his rhythm, his breath. And you weren't being courted, you were being invited. Not into a battle or a castle, but into a sentence. And somehow that was more thrilling than any tournament. So now you're holding a letter, neatly folded, edges slightly frayed, the ink just faded enough to look like it's been read more than once. It's not a declaration of love, not exactly. But the monk's careful penmanship makes each word feel hand-selected, almost like he whispered it into the parchment. And it's got you thinking. Knights might offer castles and coin, but monks, they offer presence. And that brings us to the next quiet twist in this strange little love triangle. The good provider paradox. You've heard the phrase. You've probably even rolled your eyes at it once or twice. The good provider, the strong protector, the one who brings home the metaphorical bacon, or in the case of Sir Ulrich of Loud Jousting, the literal pig, possibly slung over a shoulder. Knights were supposed to be that. They were that. Providers. They brought back plunder from raids, commanded estates, and used their muscle and questionable diplomacy skills to expand influence. But being a provider didn't necessarily mean being safe, or kind, or even available. Picture it. Lady Aveline sitting in her stone hall, watching her husband pace after returning from campaign. He hasn't stopped talking about the siege, about how he almost lost his sword, but saved it by biting a guy's ankle. You smile, nod. You're proud, sure. But you haven't seen him in 8 months, and now he's sleeping with a dagger under his pillow and shouting in his dreams. He's here, but he's not here. Meanwhile, down the hill, the monks are harvesting lentils. They aren't flashy, they aren't rich, but they're present. They grow their own food, tend their own bees, make their own mead. They live close to the land in a way that feels sustainable, and in a world of uncertainty, there's something deeply comforting about that. Let's anchor this in a bit of fact. Monasteries were economic powerhouses in the medieval period. They managed large tracts of land, operated mills, brewed beer, ran hospitals, and employed workers from nearby towns. Monks didn't fight wars, but they knew how to organize communities and resources. They provided stability, often better than the feudal lords who technically owned everything. And that made monasteries attractive not just spiritually, but practically. For women especially, whose financial security often hinged on the unpredictable whims of male relatives, a monastery wasn't just a retreat, it was a backup plan. Now, let's sprinkle in a quirky historical tidbit. Some monasteries made and sold herbal remedies that were so popular, Nobles would commission custom batches. One monastery in France was famous for a balm that allegedly cured headaches, heartbreak, and hemorrhoids, the holy trifecta. And the monk who made it, he wasn't just good with mortar and pestle, he was a local legend. Imagine being cared for by someone who knows which leaf to crush for your insomnia and doesn't make it weird. Compare that to knights, who provided through conquest. Their wealth came from violence, which meant that every gain came with a cost. Someone else's land, someone else's blood, someone else's grief. So while they technically brought home the bacon, they often also brought home trauma, guilt, or new enemies. Monks, they brought honey. You're starting to see the paradox, aren't you? Knights were supposed to be the ultimate catch, the full package of strength, wealth, and protection. But in practice, they were often distant, dangerous, or emotionally unavailable. Meanwhile, monks, who weren't even trying to win anyone, ended up offering something far more valuable: peace. And not just peace in the no one's swinging a mace kind of way, but in the you can breathe here kind of way. Historians still argue whether this monkly appeal was about affection, or whether women simply saw monasteries as safer, more manageable relationships, spiritual or platonic rather than romantic. After all, monks couldn't marry, couldn't inherit, couldn't offer a future in the typical sense. But sometimes, not having a future together was better than having a future that felt like a trap. For widows especially, monasteries often became places of real emotional freedom. Some women even funded them personally, not just out of piety, but because it gave them control, a say in something, and maybe, just maybe, access to someone who offered conversation, not command. Let's return to Lady Aveline for a moment. Her husband's off again, this time to quash a rebellion he helped cause. She takes a basket of apples to the monastery, not because she's starving, but because she wants to walk. She wants to hear the birds. She wants to talk with Brother Ivo, who once explained the phases of the moon with such patience that she cried a little. He doesn't ask her about her husband. He doesn't ask for anything. Just thanks her for the apples and offers her a sprig of mint for the headaches. And that right there, that moment, that's what makes this paradox so potent. The knight may provide for your body, but the monk, he provides for your soul, quietly, without needing a parade about it. Let's not kid ourselves. Monks weren't trying to be providers in the romantic sense. They weren't allowed to be. But that didn't stop women from noticing how self-contained, emotionally grounded, and, let's be honest, domestically competent they were. You don't have to marry someone to feel safe in their presence. And you don't have to fall in love to want to be near someone who makes you feel calm. So the paradox holds. Knights may have had gold, but monks had garlic. Knights had titles, but monks had time. And in the end, time spent in peace might have been the most priceless gift of all. You're sitting in a shadowy alcove now, light trickling through the stained glass in long, lazy strips. There's incense in the air, subtle, not overpowering. Just enough to make you breathe slower. It's quiet except for the soft sound of someone's sandals scuffing against the floor. And then you hear it, the low, warm timbre of a monk's voice. Would you like to confess? And sure, that might sound like the setup to a joke or a drama scene, but in medieval times, confession was often a strangely intimate act, one that didn't always stay within the spiritual lane. Let's talk about it. Confession or connection? Because for many noblewomen, especially those stuck in emotionally arid marriages or politically arranged unions, confession wasn't just about absolution, it was about being heard, and that mattered. Knights didn't listen, not really. Their world was governed by action, by conquest, by reaction. But monks were trained to listen deeply, without judgment, without interruption. Their entire practice was built on the idea of creating space. Space for the sacred, yes, but also space for the unsaid. And when you're a woman in medieval Europe, where almost nothing about your inner life matters to anyone, being offered that kind of space feels like stepping into a warm bath after years in the cold. Mainstream historical fact here. The sacrament of confession was formalized in the 13th century under the Fourth Lateran Council, which required Christians to confess at least once a year. This meant monks and priests became regular listeners to the private pains, fears, and moral doubts of their communities, especially the women, who often had nowhere else to go with their feelings. And what do you think happens when someone listens to you with gentle eyes, nods without judgment, and offers grace rather than advice? You begin to feel known. There's a reason so many spiritual bonds from the medieval period read like something more. Because they often were. Not scandalous necessarily, not physical, but filled with a quiet emotional intimacy that today we might call connection. Now here's your fringe fact. In some monasteries, particularly in enclosed orders, confession happened through a small, screened window in a wall, but in others, it took place in gardens or chapels, or even walking slowly together through the cloisters. The idea wasn't surveillance, it was softness. You confessed not just your sins, but your sadness, your guilt, your loneliness. So let's say you're Lady Beatrice. Your marriage is cold, your children are grown, and you haven't had an honest conversation in years. But Brother Luca, the monk who tends the chapel on your estate, offers confession every Thursday under the ash tree near the chapel pond. You start going just before dusk. You start confessing less about sin, more about sorrow, how you miss your mother, how you envy birds, how you sometimes wish you could run away and live as a baker in a coastal village. And Brother Luca listens. He doesn't scold. He doesn't correct. He just holds the silence gently until you've finished, and then he blesses you. Is it romantic? Maybe not, but it's something. Something warm. Something honest. Something that you don't get from the man who rides into your courtyard covered in blood and bad metaphors about honor. And this is where the lines start to blur. Historians still argue whether emotional intimacy with monks ever crossed the boundary into romantic or even physical territory. Some believe it was all projection, lonely women imagining connections that weren't truly mutual. Others point to surviving letters and whispered ecclesiastical scandals that suggest more than just spiritual mentoring. Whatever the case, the pattern is clear. When women needed to be heard, monks were often the only ones truly listening. It wasn't just noble women either. Lower-class women sometimes sought the same refuge in confession. They'd bring eggs or herbs as offerings. In return, they'd receive words, comfort, sometimes even practical help, healing salves, a whispered prayer for a sick child, a quiet suggestion for how to avoid a violent husband's wrath. These monks weren't saviors. They weren't perfect, but they showed up. And that act, showing up consistently, without demand or reward, often carried more emotional weight than any battlefield victory. Let's contrast it again with our friend the knight. Confiding in a knight? Risky. At best, he might try to solve your problem with brute force. Declare war on your sadness, as it were. At worst, he'd mock your vulnerability, call it weakness, or worse still, use it against you in a drunken tirade. But confessing to a monk, that was different. It was protected, sacred. Even if the emotions weren't supposed to become personal, they were still exchanged in a space of deep trust. And when that trust deepened into familiarity, when the same woman returned week after week, year after year, something tender could form. A connection built on quiet consistency. A strange, beautiful intimacy rooted in silence, repetition, and deep spiritual attention. And no, this wasn't a substitute for romantic love. But sometimes, when the world gave you nothing else, it was enough. And let's not pretend monks were immune to these emotions. There are records of monks who wrote anguished journal entries about the struggles they faced when they found themselves emotionally attached to women they were supposed to guide from a distance. One 14th century monk described a noblewoman's visit as the turning of my breath to trembling. He never named her, never even hinted at impropriety, but in that line you hear it, the ache of a heart trained to surrender, but still capable of beating. So, when women preferred monks, It wasn't because they were delusional. It was because monks offered something knights simply didn't: an open channel for human emotion, a way to be vulnerable and safe at the same time, to confess, not just to God, but to someone who wouldn't use your truth against you. And that, perhaps, is the most profound kind of intimacy of all. By now, you've slipped past the abbey gates enough times to know which stones creak underfoot and which ones hold their silence. You know where the rosemary grows wild near the eastern wall, and you've figured out that Brother Thomas hums when he's working the apiary, and that Brother Hugh always saves you a fresh crust of bread after evening prayers. So it's time to pull back the curtain just a little more. You've seen the public spaces, the garden paths, the chapel pews. But what about the parts of monastic life that women didn't always see, but sometimes did? What exactly was behind those monastic walls? Tonight you're getting a peek inside, because monasteries weren't just centers of devotion. They were their own worlds, enclosed, self-contained, and surprisingly complex. They had kitchens, refectories, libraries, workshops, vineyards, cellars, infirmaries, and yes, gardens that would make any castle herb patch look like a sad parsley pot on a windowsill. These were places that functioned independently, but they weren't isolated. Not really. People came and went. Nobles, tradesmen, farmers, students, pilgrims, and women, especially noble women, who found themselves orbiting the abbey's peace like moths to a very clean, very disciplined flame. Let's start with the garden. Monastic gardens weren't just pretty, they were practical, divided into sections for medicinal herbs, vegetables, fruit trees, and sacred plants. Lavender for calm, mint for headaches, rue for protection. Everything grown had a purpose, and monks took pride in knowing what to plant, when, and how to use it. Lady Catherine Say begins visiting the monastery to ask about salves for her son's fever, but soon she stays longer, watches the bees with Brother Oswin, learns how to dry chamomile in linen sachets. These visits turn into habits. The herbs become part of her household. So does the quiet. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Monastic herbology was an early form of medicine. Long before universities formalized medical training, monks were growing, cataloging, and prescribing plants based on a blend of observation, tradition, and classical texts. Many modern European remedies can trace their lineage back to those cloistered gardens. And here's your fringe tidbit. In some monasteries, monks trained in animal husbandry kept small flocks of sheep, not just for wool or milk, but to help calm anxious novices. That's right, monastic therapy sheep. You can't make this up. Brother Peter might have had a bad day with the Psalms, but 10 minutes with Agnes the sheep, back to inner peace. So let's talk about why women cared. Because while knights offered a castle in chaos, monks offered a life that made sense. Rhythms, cycles, peaceful productivity. They weren't showing off. They were tending to land, to bodies, to thoughts, and sometimes to women. Not in the scandalous soap opera way, but in the, here's a place where no one's demanding anything from you way. Picture Lady Catherine again. Her visits become more than medicinal. She brings food, wine, a hand-stitched altar cloth. Not bribes, not payment, gifts, offerings, quiet gestures of gratitude. The monks accept these with the same humility they offer their blessings. She learns the daily prayers, maybe not the Latin, but the rhythm, the sound. She knows when to arrive to hear Brother Oswin sing the Magnificat, because it makes her heart feel less like a clenched fist. And yes, people notice. Castle gossip begins. She spends a lot of time near the monks, they whisper. Not proper, they mutter. But no one stops her. Because what could they say? She's not doing anything wrong, just walking, listening, learning, breathing. Still, historians argue whether women's access to these private monastic spaces crossed lines of decorum. Some claim noble women were allowed too close, especially if their wealth funded an abbey's expansion. Others argue it was strictly controlled, carefully watched. Either way, where there are walls, there are doors, and where there are doors, there are ways in. Some monasteries built dedicated guest houses for noble visitors. Separate from the monks' quarters, sure, but close enough for interaction. Shared meals, shared prayers, shared silences, and in those spaces, subtle bonds could form, because while knights demanded presence, monks offered proximity, quiet, respectful, and completely unthreatening, which, for some women, made it feel safer to let their guard down. And let's not forget how many of these monasteries were family-funded. Lady Catherine may have had a cousin inside, a brother, a favorite uncle, connections that gave her reason and access to come often. Sometimes she even managed the abbey's land holdings herself, sent servants, wrote letters, requested prayers. These weren't just holy men to her, they were part of her world, and the more she visited, the more that world made sense. The garden's neat rows, the way the bell echoed at matins, the smell of bread at dawn, the handwritten note that arrived with her name in the corner and a pressed violet inside. Did monks break rules? Sometimes. Did feelings develop? Sometimes. Did anyone say it out loud? Almost never. But something deeper was happening here. A spiritual tension wrapped in routine. A kind of love that didn't need declarations or kisses. Just two people growing toward the same silence. Take this. In one preserved monastic account, a monk recorded his heartbreak over the death of a noblewoman patron. He didn't name her, but he described her voice, her laugh, her habit of plucking roses and tucking them into prayer books. She brought joy into the garden, he wrote, and I return each morning, waiting to see her shadow once more. That's not nothing. So while knights offered glory, monks offered gentleness. While castles promised status, monasteries offered rhythm. While marriage was often about heirs and property, these cloistered friendships were about time, stillness, shared presence. And sometimes that's what mattered most, because behind the monastic walls, life wasn't about conquest. It was about care. By now, you can practically smell the beeswax on your fingers and feel the crunch of gravel under your feet as you stroll beside the abbey wall. You've tasted the herbs, heard the chants, and seen the rhythms of life behind the cloister gates. But now it's time to face the one thing that monks never had to endure, and knights couldn't seem to live without. War. Because let's be real, knights were rarely home. And when they were, it wasn't exactly relaxing. There was always something going on. A crusade, a border skirmish, a squabble over land, or someone trying to one-up someone else's banner design. Which brings us to a tough but honest truth. The knight's curse was constant war, and for the women left behind, that meant long absences, endless uncertainty, and the creeping realization that love tied to a sword was often love lived in fragments. Let's start with a fact. War was the knight's profession. It wasn't just about defending home or honor. It was literally how many of them made their living. If they weren't fighting, they were training for a fight. And when they weren't doing that, they were riding to court to find a fight. The point is, if peace broke out, some knights would be bored, which if you're married to one, not ideal. Imagine being Lady Sibylla, waking up to the sound of shouting from the training yard. Your husband is home for the first time in months, and he's already broken a door trying to prove he can still swing a sword with one hand while drinking with the other. Romantic, no. War kept taking him away, and when he came back, he wasn't the same. His body was scarred, his mind was scattered. He didn't laugh the way he used to, or maybe he laughed more, too loud, too long, like something was cracked open inside him. Either way, the man who returned was always a little more distant than the one who left. And this wasn't rare, in fact, it was expected. Let's drop in a mainstream historical fact here. During the Crusades, especially the 11th to 13th centuries, knights would be gone for years at a time. Some never returned. Others came back with new debts, diseases, or half-written stories about battles so terrifying they didn't want to talk about them. That's a lot for a marriage to survive. even more for a heart to carry. And all the while, life at home had to continue. Estates didn't run themselves. Children needed raising. Taxes needed collecting. The emotional labor, a term they didn't have then, but would have needed badly, fell squarely on the women left behind. So what did some of them do? They looked for stillness, for stability, for someone who wasn't always preparing to leave. And once again, that's where monks entered the picture. Not dramatically, not with grand declarations, but by simply staying put. You're a quirky tidbit here. Some noblewomen left letters or endowments to monasteries with specific instructions, like, light a candle for my husband's safe return, or sing this hymn for my soul every Thursday. But one woman in the 12th century requested that the monks remember me more often than him. Whether that was a joke or a quiet protest, historians are still scratching their heads. And while the night was off marching across muddy fields, monks stayed where they were. They read, they wrote, they listened, they buried the dead, they visited the sick, they tended bees and mended sandals and hosted pilgrims. Their battles were spiritual, internal. They waged them every day, and no one came home screaming from those. So when Lady Sibylla visited the monastery, ostensibly to pray for her husband's safety, maybe she wasn't just seeking divine favor. Maybe she was seeking someone who would look her in the eye and see more than a political alliance. Someone who wasn't halfway out the door. It's no surprise that some of the most enduring emotional bonds in medieval letters were between noblewomen and monks. These weren't romantic flings. They were deep, nuanced, human connections forged in the quiet void that war always leaves behind. Historians still argue over the boundaries of these relationships. Were they spiritual, emotional, romantic but unspoken? The lines are blurry, and that's the point. Human connection doesn't always color inside the lines. Sometimes it's just two souls trying to survive the same storm from different shores. Monasteries became refuges, not just from war, but from the anxiety of war, from the waiting, the wondering, the news that trickled in too slowly, or never at all. And unlike the knight, whose love came in bursts of bravery, the monk's presence came in slow, steady doses, measured like prayer beads, soft like candlelight. And here's something else to chew on. In times of prolonged warfare, some women became more involved in monastic life than ever before. Not as nuns, but as managers, supporters, collaborators. They donated land, helped fund libraries, sent food, wrote letters, not because they were pious, although some were, but because it was one of the only places in medieval society where a woman could be respected for her intellect, her stability, her contributions. That respect, it was addicting, because the knight, for all his glory, often treated his wife as a side character in his hero's journey. But the monk, he saw her, maybe not as a lover, maybe not as a fantasy, but as someone with depth, with stories, with thoughts worth listening to. And sometimes, that was more nourishing than any feast or festival or fortress. Back to Lady Sibylla, who's now standing beneath a fruit tree, hands clasped, listening as Brother Alaric explains the parable of the fig. He's not preaching, he's just talking. And for once, no one expects her to be anything other than present. And yes, she still waits for her knight. She lights the candle, she prays, she hopes. But when the wax runs low and the sky turns gold, she walks the long way home, past the herb garden, past the chapel, and past the monk who always bows a little deeper when she passes. Because even if the knight comes home in glory, even if he kneels and offers her a crown of some conquered city, part of her will remember the peace she found in the place that never asked her to be anything more than herself. And maybe, just maybe, that peace was worth more than any battlefield victory. By now you've learned to spot the monk by his scent of beeswax and basil, his quiet footsteps, and the way his words feel like soft stones dropped into a still pond. He doesn't need a sword to be compelling, and honestly, his silence says more than a knight's entire family crest. But tonight, we wade into something a little stranger. because while monks weren't allowed to love romantically, they were often adored, revered, even, dare we say, crushed on. And a big part of that came down to three surprisingly powerful things: relics, rosaries, and reputation. These weren't just symbols of faith, they were signals, emblems of trust, reverence, and sometimes intrigue. Let's start with relics. Monks kept them, guarded them, displayed them. Some were holy objects said to be from the saints: a tooth, a bone, a lock of hair, or a fragment of cloth. These weren't just religious curiosities, they were considered conduits of divine power. And guess who got to handle them, interpret them, bless people with them? That's right, the monks. And look, in a world without antibiotics, soap that foamed, or reliable weather forecasts, people were hungry for a little divine assurance. Holding a piece of St. Agatha's veil, or touching the box that once held a drop of someone's sanctified blood. That could feel like a miracle. So picture this. Lady Isenda arrives at the abbey after a difficult winter. Her son has a cough that won't go away, and her heart is fraying like the sleeves of her old wool cloak. She kneels as Brother Anselm lifts the reliquary box. He speaks gently. He doesn't promise healing, but he does offer hope, a story, a reminder that suffering doesn't make her unworthy. And it works, or it helps. Either way, she keeps coming back. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Relic veneration was a cornerstone of medieval spirituality. Monasteries often built entire chapels around a single relic. Pilgrims would travel for days, even weeks, to see them. And monks, by virtue of tending these relics, became gatekeepers of comfort. And then there were rosaries. Simple, beautiful, tactile. They weren't just prayer tools, they were art. And monks often crafted them by hand from bone, wood, or semi-precious stones. Each bead worn smooth by prayer, each loop a quiet testimony to discipline and devotion. When a woman received one, gifted, blessed, or simply borrowed, it wasn't just a string of beads. It was a connection to something bigger than herself. And if the monk who offered it had kind eyes or remembered her favorite hymn, well, let's just say emotions got braided into those strings right alongside the prayers. Now, for your fringe tidbit. Some rosaries were double-ended, designed so two people could pray simultaneously, facing each other, mirroring movement, silently bound in rhythm. It wasn't romantic on paper, but imagine holding one end of a rosary while a monk holds the other, silent, intentional, in sync. Tell me that wouldn't rearrange your soul just a little. And finally, reputation. Monks had it. Maybe not fame in the knightly sense, but respect, and sometimes admiration. Unlike knights, whose reputations were often tied to violence or scandal, monks were known for wisdom, kindness, healing, and prayer. They didn't need to win tournaments to gain followers. They simply had to show up, day after day, quietly, reliably, intentionally. Lady Isenda isn't the only one who notices. Others whisper about Brother Anselm. He listens. He remembers names. He wept during the Passion reading. This is the medieval version of someone being good with kids and likes poetry. You better believe women took note, and for some women, especially those trapped in loveless marriages or public roles that turn them into chess pieces, that kind of gentle stability became deeply attractive. Historians still argue whether women truly idealized monks or whether they simply found emotional outlets in religious rituals. But there's no denying the symbolism. Monks stood for something beyond the chaos of worldly life. They were rooted, calm, centered. And in a world that spun a little too fast on blood-stained wheels, that meant everything. Knights, for all their swagger and sparkle, lived in a world of status. Always climbing, always fighting. Even their love had stakes. Alliances, dowries, inheritance. But monks, their love, if it could be called that, was offered without expectation, and sometimes that was the most seductive thing of all. Now back to Lady Isenda, who begins to bring fresh bread to the monastery once a week. She claims it's in thanksgiving for answered prayers, but perhaps it's also because she enjoys the way Brother Anselm smiles when he sees her, the way he bows, the way he says her name like it's sacred. She starts wearing her blessed rosary under her gown, not for show, just to feel it there. And sometimes, at night, she runs her fingers across the beads and imagines his voice reciting the same prayer, the same rhythm, the same stillness. Not passion, not scandal, just quiet connection. And in a life full of noise and demands, that can feel like love. So yes, while knights were clanging around in armor, trying to earn their place in history, monks were sitting in the chapel, holding a candle in the dark, whispering someone's name during Compline. Guess who women remembered longer? Exactly. By this point, you're walking slower. The world of sword clangs and tournament trumpets is a distant echo now. You're lingering near cloister arches, watching shadows stretch across sun-warmed stone, and letting your breath fall into rhythm with something ancient and still. Because tonight, we're going somewhere quieter, deeper, beyond war, beyond even relics and rosaries. We're stepping into that strange, paradoxical space where solitude is shared, and sometimes it's in that very quiet that connection grows the strongest. Let's talk about shared solitude. It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? But in medieval monastic life, it wasn't. It was the cornerstone of everything. You could live side by side with someone in silence for months, and still feel more known by them than by the person who shared your bed. And that's what drew certain women, particularly noble women, toward the quiet edges of the monastery. You see, medieval noble life didn't offer much space for stillness. Castles were loud, political, performative. Everything you said could be used against you, or married off in a strategic alliance. Even your moments of privacy were borrowed, and rarely truly your own. So when a woman walked through the gatehouse of an abbey, something changed. The air slowed, the expectations lifted, and instead of being expected to speak, she was allowed simply to be. Let's introduce Lady Allais. Widowed, young, childless, and too educated for her own good, Allais found herself drawn more and more to the chapel near her estate. She liked the echo of her footsteps on the floor, the way her thoughts finally had room to stretch. And Brother Benedict, the monk who tended the lamps, never asked her questions. He simply nodded in greeting and went back to his task. They started sitting near each other during services, not together, just near, a few pews apart, facing the altar, eyes down, breathing the same incense, hearing the same Latin verses whispered over stone. No words, but something grew. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Monasteries often welcomed lay visitors into their public liturgical life. While cloistered monks and nuns followed strict internal routines, there were spaces, chapels, side aisles, gardens, where the public, including women, could participate in prayer without ever needing to speak. And for some women, especially those navigating grief, loss, or spiritual restlessness, these spaces became lifelines, not just to God, but to others seeking the same peace. So what does shared solitude feel like? It's the opposite of loneliness. It's two people sitting quietly in a space that's big enough for both their silences. And when you've spent your life performing femininity, enduring unwanted touch, or being spoken over, finding someone who lets you rest beside them without interruption is more profound than you'd think. Monks, of course, weren't supposed to form attachments, and many didn't. They kept to their vows, to their rule, to the rhythm of prayer and labor, but feelings aren't always loud. Sometimes they just show up in small acts, offering someone the better bench, refilling their oil lamp, leaving a folded note in a psalter with a verse underlined. Here's your fringe fact. In some monasteries, specific seats were carved into stone cloisters for solitary prayer, often spaced at equal intervals. Occasionally, two would be side by side, no wall between them. There's no record of why, but some scholars speculate they were for mentorship or shared meditation. So imagine Lady Allais returning each day at the same hour, sitting in the same spot, not to talk, not to be seen, but to feel that familiar presence nearby. Brother Benedict doesn't speak, but when he finishes his prayers, he nods, just once before walking away. And somehow, that single gesture carries more intimacy than a knight's entire sonnet. Because the truth is, not all connection is verbal, and not all romance looks like roses. Historians still argue whether shared religious spaces created a safe zone for emotion, or if, ironically, they intensified the temptation to cross boundaries. Was it holiness that made the monk irresistible, or was it the very forbiddenness of the relationship that made it bloom? But whether these silent bonds were platonic, emotional, or quietly romantic, one thing is clear: they mattered. In fact, some noble women chose to be buried near the monasteries they frequented. Not in their family crypts, not alongside their husbands, but near the gardens and chapels where they had once sat beside someone who saw them as more than a title. There's something tender in that decision, something quietly rebellious. Back to Lady Elais, who now brings a blanket with her. The chapel is cold in the mornings, and Brother Benedict has arthritis. She leaves it near his stool, folded, neat, no note, just there. He never says thank you, just wears it. And that's the thing, their connection isn't a story, it's a ritual, a shared rhythm, a way of saying, "You are seen," without needing to name it. And while the knight might have brought home a jeweled brooch from the Holy Land, Brother Benedict offers something rarer: presence, patience, and the astonishing gift of being quiet together. So, shared solitude. It isn't flashy, it won't make it into the songs, but it's real. It lingers. It nourishes in a way that declarations can't, because sometimes the most lasting love is the one that never had to speak. By now, you know better than to be fooled by silence. The monastery may hum with quiet discipline on the surface, but even the holiest walls have echoes, and some of those echoes, they're gossip, whispered through cloister corridors, half sung behind chapel veils, scrawled in tiny margins that were never meant for eyes outside the scriptorium. Because yes, even monks had drama. Welcome to the gossip cloister, where not every robe is pure, not every vow is kept, and not every noblewoman walks away unremembered. Let's start here. Monasteries were human institutions, full of real people with real emotions and the same capacity for mischief, longing, or plain old poor judgment as anyone else. And just because they wore robes and spoke Latin didn't mean they didn't have secrets. Some just happened to be very good at keeping them. Here's your mainstream historical fact. There are surviving records from various ecclesiastical courts across Europe documenting charges of inappropriate contact between monks and laywomen. These weren't always scandalous affairs. Sometimes it was as small as a hand held too long in prayer, or a letter passed through a scribe. But sometimes it went further. Historians still argue over how common this really was. Some say it was rare, exaggerated by hostile outsiders. Others suggest it happened often enough to have protocols, punishments, and a whole category of whispered stories passed down from monk to monk, abbey to abbey. Let's talk about one of those whispers. A 13th century chronicle from Normandy mentions a monk, Brother Guillaume, who was reassigned suddenly and without explanation. Local gossip said he'd been too familiar with a widowed noblewoman who donated a new bell tower to the abbey. The record never names her, but the monk's journal, surviving only in fragments, includes this: "Her voice remains in my prayer like incense I did not light." That line tells you everything. Maybe it wasn't physical, maybe it was worse, emotional, unspoken, eternal. And this isn't a one-off. In some preserved manuscripts, scholars have found marginalia, those little doodles in the borders of sacred texts that go beyond playful. Tiny notes addressed to initials, sketches of clasped hands. One monk even drew a heart pierced by a quill, not a sword, a quill. That's monk speak for feelings they definitely weren't supposed to be having. And noble women weren't naive to this. Some of them leaned into it. Picture Lady Clarice, sharp-minded, sharper-tongued, well-read in the Psalms and politics. She's been married off twice, widowed twice, and now she runs her late husband's estate with ruthless efficiency. But she's lonely, and she likes visiting the monastery near her lands. Not for confession, not really, but for conversation. Brother Mathieu is young, smart, serious. He blushes when she compliments his calligraphy. She makes a habit of sitting a little too close during Vespers. She donates a new psalter to the scriptorium with a note. For the monk who sees more than ink. The inscription is unsigned. Did anything happen? Depends on who you ask. To the official record, she was a generous patron. To the steward who polished the abbey floors, she visited often, always left smiling. To Brother Mathieu, well, he was reassigned to a priory 2 counties away by spring, and yet these small scandals, whether imagined, real, or something tangled in between, didn't necessarily ruin reputations. In fact, they sometimes enhanced them. The monk who kept his vows despite temptation, seen as stronger, more devout. The noblewoman whose name was murmured just a little too softly during prayers, wrapped in mystery. There's even a fringe tidbit for you. In some monasteries, monks were forbidden from looking women in the eyes. Seriously, eye contact was considered too risky, because even a glance, prolonged, loaded, could spark something that vows weren't prepared to handle, and so the rules multiplied. Chaperones during meetings, screens in confession, letters passed through abbots, but still, the stories slipped through, because even in sacred spaces, desire finds a way to speak. It doesn't shout, it doesn't sing, it writes in margins, lingers in gestures. It's the extra candle lit during Compline, the hymn repeated because she liked that one, the herbal remedy crafted with a little extra rosemary. Knights might have lovers and affairs embroidered into ballads, but monks had memories no one could name aloud, and maybe that's why they lingered longer. Because forbidden love, the kind that's never acted upon, the kind buried beneath layers of ritual and restraint, can burn slower, brighter, even when it lives only in the quiet spaces between syllables. Back to Lady Clarice. Her visits taper off after Brother Mathieu is reassigned. She says the chapel isn't the same. She donates a final altar cloth, embroidered with a phoenix, a symbol of renewal, or maybe just something that rises quietly from ashes, without anyone ever asking why. So the gossip cloister isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It hums under everything, whispers through hymns, glides across gardens like wind, because monks weren't saints, not really, and women weren't just visitors. And sometimes a look across a stone colonnade says more than any love letter ever could. You're starting to realize that the monastery wasn't just a place. It was a possibility. And sometimes, that possibility didn't come wrapped in candlelight or tucked inside the folds of a heartfelt letter. Sometimes it looked like a woman simply walking away from everything she was told to want. Let's talk now about freedom. Specifically freedom from the male gaze. Because if knights saw women as prizes to be won, claimed, or displayed like hunting trophies in velvet, monks, at their best, didn't see women that way at all. And in a time when women were watched, judged, and constantly corrected, that kind of not being seen was its own form of relief. Let's start with a hard truth. Noble women in medieval Europe lived under relentless scrutiny. Their worth was tied to appearance, fertility, obedience, and lineage. Everything they wore, said, or did was subject to commentary by men, other women, the court, the kitchen staff, and even the priests during Sunday Mass. You were either too quiet or too bold, too cold or too flirtatious, too pious or too political. And no matter what you did, someone was always watching, measuring, whispering. Enter the monastery, a place where you could finally disappear, and not in the dramatic, run away to join the nunnery kind of way, but in the sense that you could step outside the exhausting loop of performance. You could enter a garden, sit beneath a tree, and just exist. Not as someone's wife or daughter or bargaining chip, but as a soul, a being, a presence. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many monasteries, particularly those near noble estates, created outer enclosures or guest areas where lay people, especially women, could stay temporarily. These spaces were intentionally designed to be quiet, contemplative, and shielded from the social demands of courtly life. In these spaces, monks didn't ask questions. They didn't flatter or flirt. They offered hospitality, prayer, and, maybe most importantly, privacy. And to a woman used to having her worth assessed by her waistline or her father's estate, that was more seductive than any poem from a lovesick knight. Let's meet Lady Rahiz, daughter of a duke, married at 16, widowed by 22. She's lived her whole life with eyes on her, from tutors, from suitors, from servants, even from the portrait painters who always insisted on putting her in a red gown she hated because it makes you look more virtuous. She doesn't want to be virtuous, or beautiful, or anything. She wants to rest. So she arranges to spend a fortnight at the abbey nearby, a spiritual retreat officially. She brings books, paper, ink, a few changes of linen. She tells no one what she plans to do with her time, and what she does is nothing. She walks the gardens, sits by the well, writes scraps of poetry she never signs. She eats alone, sleeps alone, and breathes deeply for the first time in a decade. Brother Simon, the monk assigned to show her around, doesn't hover, doesn't comment on her appearance, doesn't ask why she doesn't attend every service. He simply nods when she passes, as if to say, "You are here, that is enough. Now for your fringe tidbit." Some monasteries had anchor holds, tiny cells built into or against the monastery walls where women, and sometimes men, lived in permanent seclusion, praying and existing in silence. They would often communicate with the world only through a small window. This was seen as the ultimate spiritual retreat. But for some women, it was also the only place where they could live completely free from judgment. Lady Rahiz doesn't take it that far, but she does begin to spend longer stretches in the chapel alone. Not because she's devout exactly, but because she likes how it feels to sit somewhere where no one expects her to say anything smart, or beautiful, or useful. It's a slow kind of healing, not flashy, not dramatic, just real. Historians still debate whether these spaces of silence were empowering or oppressive. Were women retreating or reclaiming, escaping or resisting? But when you listen closely to their letters, their records, their donations, their decisions, you start to see a pattern. Women sought out monasteries not just for God, but for themselves, for space, for time, for a break from being seen only through someone else's lens. Back in the castle, a knight watches Lady Rahiz's absence with confusion. She's refused his third marriage proposal. Again, he thinks she's grieving, or playing hard to get. She's not. She's just learning what it feels like to be unobserved. And that, ironically, is where she finally starts to see herself. No mirrors, no tapestries, no admiring glances, just her reflection in the monastery's well, just the curve of her shadow at sundown, just the rustle of her gown against stone, heard only by the wind, and it's enough. The monastery doesn't fix her. It doesn't erase her sorrow or her memories, or the weight of what the world once demanded, but it gives her the first taste of what life might look like, without the constant gaze of men trying to claim her. And the monk? Brother Simon smiles, bows once when she leaves, and never asks where she'll go next. He doesn't need to, because what he gave her, what the monastery gave her, wasn't guidance or permission or even comfort. It was invisibility, beautiful, sacred, chosen invisibility. And in a world where women were always seen as something to be shaped, taken, or improved, sometimes the most radical thing was to step outside the frame entirely, to vanish into stillness, and feel, for the first time, that you were finally whole. You've followed the footsteps into cloistered gardens, sat in the shared silence of stone chapels, and watched noble women pull away from a world of pageantry to something still and strange and deeply theirs. But now, as twilight folds in around this medieval tale, we need to look at something even more intimate, something etched not in memory or rumor, but in ink, because tonight we're cracking open parchment and peeling back seals. We're reading the words women left behind, scattered across centuries, words they were never supposed to write, or that someone hoped would never be found. It's time to talk about how some women didn't just choose peace over passion, they wrote their way there. Welcome to Writing the Heart Out. In a time when female voices were often filtered through scribes, family alliances, and arranged marriages, writing became a quiet rebellion. Letters, poems, prayer books, these were some of the few places women could speak without interruption, and sometimes they wrote about monks. Let's begin with the basics. Medieval women of noble birth were far more literate than many assume. While they weren't usually formally educated like the men, many noble women were taught to read, especially religious texts. And those with money or influence often learned to write too, at least enough to correspond with husbands, family, abbots, or yes, certain monks. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Letter writing was a highly respected form of communication in the Middle Ages, and monasteries often acted as mail hubs. Monks copied and carried correspondence for noble households, and many served as secretaries or advisors. This created a strange, tender gray space where thoughts could travel back and forth under the safe banner of religious discourse. But what if that religious discourse also included metaphors that curled like ivy around confession? A certain psalm referenced one too many times? A letter signed not just with a name, but with a symbol? Let's meet Lady Ismay. She lived in a damp, drafty stone castle on the edge of Yorkshire, married to a baron who loved battle more than bread. And while he was off defending honor for the 4th time that year, she was left with a garden full of frost, a chapel full of echoes, and a heart that felt like a locked door. So she wrote. She wrote to the abbey's prior, ostensibly to discuss the transfer of tithes. But when Brother Aelred replied with a line from the Song of Songs and a drawing of a dove in the margins, she responded with a second verse, underlined. No declarations, no confessions, just scriptures, passed like secrets. That's how it went. A correspondence of devotion, with pauses long enough to make a heart race. Now here's your fringe tidbit. In some monasteries, especially in regions like southern France and northern Italy, there are preserved letters between noble women and monks, where the tone slips from reverent to affectionate. The addresses begin formally, most devout brother, but end with tenderness. May your prayers carry me with you always. What was going on? Scholars still argue. Some say these letters were coded expressions of forbidden love. Others say it was simply the emotional vocabulary of the time, florid, symbolic, and deeply spiritual. But a few historians agree. Some women were absolutely flirting through scripture. And why not? When you're denied the right to choose your own husband, to express longing openly, or to speak plainly in court, metaphors become your playground. And monks, so accustomed to speaking in symbols, were sometimes the only ones who understood the language. Lady Ismay's letters were eventually copied and stored in the monastery archive, though no one knows why. Perhaps Brother Aelred couldn't bear to burn them. Perhaps he read them before Compline each night, heart heavy, vows intact. The last letter from her ends simply, "Do the doves return in spring? I wait." There is no response recorded. And yet you feel it, that ache of words unsent or unsaid. Because in a world where knights offered gifts with trumpets, monks offered something quieter, a space to write without being erased. For some women, writing was not just expression, it was resistance, a way to preserve themselves, to hold on to their inner world when everything external was dictated by politics, propriety, or property. And sometimes, the writing wasn't just to monks. Some women wrote about monks, in poems, songs, or marginal notes in their own prayer books. They penned descriptions of faces glimpsed in candlelight, of voices heard in chant, of brief moments when someone looked at them and didn't see a title. There's a scratch line found in a 14th century Book of Hours owned by a noblewoman, written faintly between the margins of the Annunciation scene. He said nothing, only passed me the book, but I think he heard my soul. We'll never know who he was, but something tells you it wasn't the knight at the next banquet. So what do we take from this? That the heart needs an outlet, always. And for some women in medieval Europe, that outlet was ink. Knights may have promised glory, legacy, and a dozen sons, but monks, just by being still, by reading the same verse over and over, by answering letters with care, offered women the chance to rediscover something deeper, their own voices. And even now, centuries later, you can hear those voices if you listen closely enough. Whispers in parchment, margins full of longing, lines that say, "I see you," lines that ask, "Do you see me too?" So here you are, near the end of the story. You've wandered through halls lit by beeswax and burdened with longing, listened to women whisper their truths into confessionals and parchments, watched them slip quietly through gardens in search of something no castle ever gave them. And now we circle back to the question that started it all. Why did some women prefer monks over knights? The answer is soft, unfinished, more silence than sound. But tonight, let's wrap it into a thought so simple it almost disappears. Sometimes, peace is the romance. Let's revisit what knights offered. Boldness, bravado, a good story, and occasionally a goat wrapped in ribbon. They gave women security, in a very loud and sword-swingy kind of way. But they also brought war, absence, pressure, expectation. Their love, if it came at all, came blazing like a torch. But torches burn out. Monks were different. Not because they were lovers, but because they weren't trying to be. Their presence was calm, consistent. No performance, no demand, just rhythm, just presence. And sometimes that's what the heart wants most. Lady Asenda and her rosary, Lady Alais and the shared silence, Lady Ismay and her doves. None of them stormed castles. None of them were written into courtly epics. But they lived something rare, a kind of quiet defiance. They chose peace, stillness, moments of truth that didn't come wrapped in titles or rewards. And in choosing monks, or at least the idea of monks, they weren't just avoiding knights. They were stepping out of a system that told them what love was supposed to look like and choosing something different, something softer. Let's call it a counter-romance. Not the romance of conquest, but the romance of care. Not the thrill of possession, but the gentleness of permission. Not take me, but let me be. Historians still debate the meaning of these stories. Was it love? Was it friendship? Spiritual admiration? Projection? We may never pin it down exactly. And maybe that's the point. These connections lived in the margins, of letters, of gardens, of society, and maybe they were never meant to be defined. What matters is that they mattered, that these women found, in their own quiet ways, what knights could not give them, peace. And maybe that peace came at a cost. No public devotion, no wedding feasts, no tapestries woven in their honor, just memories, private and often unspoken, but those memories lasted. A knight's love may have lit up the court for a season, but a monk's quiet companionship, that stayed tucked in the soul, like a pressed flower in the back of a psalter. So yes, some women preferred monks, not because they didn't want passion, but because they'd seen what happened when passion went unchecked, and they chose instead the man who listened, who stayed, who passed them rosemary, or a psalm, or nothing at all, just a glance that said, "I see you." That's a different kind of love, the kind that doesn't need to be written down in bold letters, because it's already carved into the soft stone of a cloister wall, warmed by afternoon sun, where someone once sat beside someone else, and neither one had to say a thing. And now, as the story folds closed and the candles burn low, you find yourself back in your own room, still, quiet, safe. Maybe the hum of the fan feels like distant chants. Maybe the shadows on the ceiling remind you of cloister arches. Maybe part of you is still sitting beside that garden well, hands warm from a cup of herbal tea, passed by someone who never asked for anything in return. That's the thing about these stories. They don't end in fireworks. They fade gently, like footsteps down a stone hallway, like a prayer whispered just once, like the smell of lavender that lingers on your sleeve long after the sprig has fallen away. You don't need a knight to ride in and save you. You don't need a battle. or a banner, or even a vow. Sometimes, what you need is a space to breathe, someone to see you without claiming you. A moment of quiet that says, simply, you're allowed to be here, so let the noise of the world fall behind you. Let the warmth of stillness wrap around your shoulders like a monastic robe, soft, unassuming, and just heavy enough to remind you that you are grounded. You've journeyed through ink, silence, and slow-blooming affection, and now it's time to rest. Let your thoughts settle like dust on old stone. Let your breath move like candle smoke. And if a gentle voice speaks in your dreams tonight, maybe it's not calling you to action. Maybe it's just saying, stay, sleep, you are safe here. Good night.